Hey, this is Phil Carlton, and I saw a question on Facebook about using the insert color commands. And so I'm going to work in Modify for a couple of minutes and just play with the design and show a couple of things here. So I'm in Modify. I'm going to go under File and down to Insert. And then I'm going to browse into my samples, Premiere Plus 2 EMB, Stitch 2, Flowers. Scroll down into my flowers, and I'm going to grab this petal swirl.vp4. I'm going to select it and click Open to bring it in. I thought this was a kind of an easy design to just kind of play with for a couple of minutes and look at inserting some color changes and talk about what happens when we do that. So if you look across the bottom, first of all, I want to notice a couple of things about this. This design has 5,266 stitches. So the slider at the bottom will let me display part of the stitches at a time. If I use this button right here, which is Draw Next Color Block, it will walk through color by color. When I click it the first time, it's showing me color number 1, which is the green. If I notice in the left-hand corner, it's showing me from stitch 1 to stitch number 2894. So it's showing me the first almost 3,000 stitches of the design. If I click the next time, it's going to show me from 2895 to the end of the design. Now I can also use these sliders if I want to see part of the design, but not necessarily entire color. That can help if you're trying to say, I'm trying to get to these stitches, for example. By dragging the slider to the left and hiding stitches, it would make it easy for me to isolate and select just part of this design if I wanted to delete them, for example. I'm going to come down to the lower right-hand corner and click Draw All Stitches to turn everything back on. Now I want to talk about, say, I want to add a color change here. I want to make some of these leaves red and some of them green. I'm going to first uncheck color number 2. So when I uncheck a color, it hides it temporarily, so I can't accidentally delete those stitches. So now again, it's kind of the same thing. I'm seeing just the green. But before I add colors, I want to look at the order and how this is drawing or how this is stitching out. So I'm going to drag the slider all the way to the left and then just drag it slowly so we can see what happens as it stitches. Notice the first thing that's visible at stitch 1 of 1, or at the very first stitch, is a color command telling the machine we're going to use a green thread. Now as I drag to the right, it does some underlay, draws that first satin, does a little more underlay, and travels down. And then I see it start to do a running stitch to travel under these pink stitches to do the next leaf. Now if I turn on the ghost mode down in the lower right-hand corner, ghost mode will show me any of my stitches that are hidden. So now I know those stitches are there, I know where they are, but because it's still unchecked and they're hidden, I can't accidentally delete them. So I'm going to just drag this a little bit further so we see that as it's drawing all these different leaves, it's doing running stitches to connect all these different green leaves, but all of those running stitches are going to eventually be hidden by the pink stitching. So first I'm going to go over to the View tab, and I want to change to 2D View with stitch points for a second. I'm going to click my Zoom to Rectangle and click in so I can see the stitches between the first leaf and the second pair. And you'll see there's a running stitch that just runs across here before it draws the second and third leaves and continues on. Now let's go over to the Modify tab. And on the Modify tab, this is where we can add or change things at the stitch level. So in my imagination, what I want to do for this example is after that first green leaf, I want to change the rest of the leaves to red. So I'm going to click on Insert Color Change, and then when I come down, and if I click, so my stitches are traveling here from left to right. So if I click after this stitch right here, I'm going to click anywhere in this little stitch area. When I click, it's going to bring up a dialog box. I'm going to specify just a red color and click OK. And where I had that stitch previously, it turned it into a color command. So now sequentially what's going to happen is at the beginning I have my green stitches, and then at the point I clicked, it changed everything from that point forward to red until it gets to the pink color command that was already in the design. So let's zoom out a little bit. And I'm going to go back for a moment to my view and go to 3D view. So now I've done the green, it's changed it to a red. So say I want these last 2 leaves to be green as well. I'm going to go back to the Modify tab, my insert color command was actually still active, but I could click on it again if I had deselected it. I know that after it does all these leaves on the right side, it's doing a running stitch back over here and heading over here. So anywhere in this area, I'm going to click here to add a color command, and then I'm going to change that back to a green and click OK. I think I picked the same green. Now where I clicked is added another color command. I'm going to right click to deselect that tool. In the lower right hand corner, I'm going to click Draw All Stitches, which turns everything back on. And let's zoom out just a little bit so we can see that entire design. So now I added a color change here that changed it to red. It continued in red until I added another color change to go to green. And so if I stitched this out right now, that's what would happen. It would stitch that one, it would have a color change, it would ask for red. Now, if I click, I'm going to go to the Home tab and click Color Sort, and it actually put those two green colors together. So that means because they were the same green, it's going to stitch them without having to change the thread to red, then back to green. In this case, it did the red, then it did all the green. But I want to look at one other thing that happened here. So I'm going to uncheck color 1, and I'm going to uncheck color 3 so that I can see just my greens. I'm going to click Zoom to Rectangle and zoom into these greens. And what I'm seeing now, I'm going to zoom in even further so we can really see what's happening here, is there is a little trim command here. Let's go back to the 2D view with stitch points. That little T, the green T right there, is a trim command. That tells me that it's going to stitch that first leaf, it's going to do a trim, and then it's going to move down here and continue running. Now, if I add color changes, and I don't do any color changes, when I get to my machine, it will secure the thread. It will do a tie-on before or after, or at the beginning or end of any color change. But what I'm seeing now here is I'm going to have this trim command. It's going to jump and immediately start that running stitch. And there's not any kind of tie-off right here to secure the thread or a tie-off before this trim command. So when I start adding color changes, I want to look at what's going to happen when I get to the machine. In this case, I do want to make sure that it's going to secure these threads. So I'm going to go back to the Modify tab, and I'm going to click. First of all, I know it's traveling from this leaf down here, gets to that trim command. I want it to do a tie-off to secure that thread before it jumps. So I'm going to click on Insert Tie-Off and just click on this last little stitch. And you'll notice it just added a couple of stitch points there, so now I know that thread is going to be secure. Then I'm going to click Insert Tie On, click on that little stitch right there, and it added stitch points before it continues that running stitch. I'm going to go ahead and right click to deselect that tool. So now I know it's going to stitch the first leaf, do a tie off, do the jump, it's going to do a tie on and continue stitching, so I don't have to worry about those threads coming undone. I'm going to click undo a couple of times and talk about one other thing that I could have done. So now I have the tie-off. Say I see here, I can see because I'm in ghost mode, I know that those pink stitches are going to travel through here, so I can actually connect these two objects so that they will stitch without a jump. So let's do that. The first thing I'm going to do is delete commands and get rid of this trim because I don't want it to trim. I want it to stitch continuously. Now I see I have a jump stitch going, or a big long stitch going from that point to that point, which would be visible. So I'm going to click on Insert Stitches, and when I insert stitches, I just kind of click here, and when I clicked on that stitch, now it's almost like on a rubber band, and I'm just going to click every couple of millimeters to add stitches. I'm not going to worry too much about these being super precise because I know this is all going to get covered up at the end by that pink stitching. Now when I right click, I can see that I've got a running stitch that's going all the way through here and connecting those two green stitches. I'm going to right click to deselect that tool. I'm going to turn all my stitches back on. I'm going to zoom to fit so I can see my entire design and go back to the 3D view. So now if we watch this stitch out, I'm going to drag my slider all the way to the left. As I drag it to the right, it's going to start with that red. Those are all connected. And here's the fun part. It's going to start now with that green stitch. It had the color change at the beginning. And then after it finishes this one, it's going to do that running stitch that we created. And then stitch those three green pieces all connected and finish it off by covering it with that pink stitching. So that's just a little bit about how, when you're working with the Modify tab, you can insert color commands, you can insert stitches, and also think about what's happening as far as how are your threads being secured when you tie on or tie off. before or after a jump stitch, especially when you start making changes to a design that you haven't digitized and you're adding trims or you're adding jumps into the design.